The snow never stopped falling. It whispered over the pines and settled on rusted artillery older than most of the men who now manned it. The world had gone silent weeks ago, save for the eerie hum of alien ships above the clouds. Cities fell. Satellites went dark. Command went quiet. All that remained were fragmented units and relics from wars long past. They called it the Galactic Empire, a coalition of 1,000 species, millions of ships, technology so advanced it mocked gravity and time itself. They arrived not with diplomacy, but with ultimatums and fusion bombardments. When Earth's modern militaries were wiped out in orbital strikes, resistance didn't end. It devolved into grit, into memory, into men like Sergeant Harlan and the 155mm M114 Howitzer they dragged out of the museum. Their broadcast started after Geneva burned. In every known language, they declared Earth a protectorate. Surrender was mandatory. Compliance meant survival. Resistance meant extinction. The voice was always calm, always condescending. Lay down your relics. You are not equipped to fight. The snow kept falling. Somewhere in the valley below, strange lights shimmered between the trees. Skimmers, small scout craft, shaped like manta rays, hovering without sound. Harlan clicked off the safety. Behind him, Private Lee cursed under his breath, loading a shell that weighed more than he did. No targeting computers, no radar. Just coordinates scribbled by hand and calculated with a slide rule. Firing solutions set, Lee said. Range 7,000, Harlan replied. Compensate for drift. 2 degrees left. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a symbol. Every pull of that lanyard was defiance made real. The first shot cracked the valley like thunder. A slow, arching shell vanished into the storm. Seconds later, a blinding burst lit the forest. The radio crackled. Screams, not human. Alien chatter scrambled into chaos. One skimmer gone. The others scattered like startled birds. They didn't expect that. Above, more shapes emerged from the clouds. Saucer-like behemoths that pulsed with blue energy. Observation units. Maybe something worse. Harlan didn't care. Another shell was already being loaded. No awe, no hesitation. Just work. Back at command, what little was left of it, a colonel whispered into an analog transmitter, eyes wide. They hit it? They actually hit one. The broadcast changed. This resistance is unauthorized. Cease fire immediately. Primitive kinetic artillery is insufficient to harm authorized enforcement units. The men laughed. Lee spat into the snow. Guess we're unauthorized now. It was true. Their howitzers were relics. Steel and grease and recoil. But the aliens didn't understand the human mind. Not really. They thought progress made old ways obsolete. They thought war was a matter of computation. They forgot war was survival. Harlan glanced at the empty shell crate and nodded to the next. 2 more shots. 2 more skimmers. The fourth adjusted, dodged the impact, but only barely. They weren't invincible, just arrogant. Word spread like fire through the resistance bands. Outposts in Norway and Poland reported similar results. Crude weaponry wreaking havoc on high-tech invaders. The Empire adapted slowly, dismissing the early results as anomalies. Earth was backwater, unworthy of real strategy. That mistake would cost them. Humans didn't need superiority. They needed only a chance. And now they had it. They came back angrier. Larger crafts, layered in armor that shimmered against the snow like molten glass, descended with squadrons of infantry drones. The message was clear. The Empire wasn't amused. They weren't there to conquer anymore. They were there to punish. The howitzer had gone silent for a few hours. Not because it was broken, but because the crew was conserving ammunition and planning something bigger. Harlan gathered with the remnants of 2 other squads. None of them had matching uniforms anymore. Scraps of camo, gear duct taped to vests, and old rifles that had outlived their factories. They huddled over hand-drawn maps and elevation lines, tracing firing arcs and choke points with frozen fingers. Old veterans called it terrain fighting. Modern militaries called it obsolete. But humans had a memory for war, and that memory was about to be weaponized. Using leftover wires and junked electronics, they set up remote detonators linked to artillery shells buried along the trail. They didn't need to penetrate shields if they could bury shrapnel in engines or tear legs off the mech suits that followed. It wasn't elegant. It was ruthless. At first light, Empire scouts moved into the valley. Sleek armor, curved limbs, pulse rifles slung low. They advanced like they were walking into a zoo exhibit. Curious, dismissive. One triggered a pressure plate. The blast tore half its unit apart, flipping a skimmer that hovered too close. The rest opened fire in every direction, hitting nothing but trees. That's when the Howitzer sang again. A direct hit on a mid-sized transport turned it into a rising plume of alien fire. The radio screamed open with panicked alien comms. The Empire didn't know how to panic until Earth showed them. Every explosion taught them something their simulations had never accounted for: human improvisation. Harlan's crew kept moving, never staying in one place long enough for a retaliatory strike. They had set up secondary firing positions using decoys, empty barrels dressed to look like artillery from a distance, bait for alien sensors. When the Empire bombed them, they wasted munitions and gave away their positions. Lee coordinated with a ham radio operator 3 valleys over. The signal was faint, full of static and bursts of alien jamming, but it got through. Coordinates were relayed. A skimmer unit was ambushed by mortars from a century-old bunker no satellite had mapped. The Empire couldn't comprehend how humans could operate without centralized command. Because they didn't operate, they adapted. And for every drone or scout ship the Empire sent down, they learned a little more. But so did the humans. Alien armor cracked under concentrated fire. Their plasma shields couldn't repel ballistic fragments from close range. Their AI struggled with guerrilla tactics. They were fast. They were strong. But they weren't used to fighting creatures who fought like they had nothing to lose. Empire commanders debated escalation protocols. Deploy heavier assets? Risk capital ships in atmosphere? They assumed Earth's resistance was disorganized, fracturing under pressure. But what they were seeing wasn't chaos. It was clarity, the kind born of desperation and a total rejection of surrender. The Howitzer's kill count ticked up. 5, 7, 9. More than some modern tanks had achieved in their prime. A relic of steel and powder doing the work of gods. Alien corpses froze in the snow, their fluids crystallizing under the mountain cold. The Empire had shields, reactors, artificial gravity. But they weren't built for Earth. Not really. Their tech was too clean, too precise, too dependent on systems that assumed their enemies played by the same rules. Humans didn't play by rules. They burned them. In one daring move, a local band of farmers used an old diesel tractor rigged with explosives to bait a low-flying gunship into range of the Howitzer. The explosion took out the craft and part of the cliff behind it, showering the valley with debris and forcing the Empire to retreat for regrouping. No one cheered. There wasn't time. They just reloaded. Empire signals began encrypting. Their broadcasts changed tone from condescension to cold warning. Cease hostilities. Further resistance will result in planetary culling. No one listened. Not even the civilians. Resistance wasn't a military order anymore. It was a contagion. The humans didn't fight because they thought they could win. They fought because someone had to. Because every shell fired reminded the stars that Earth was not silent, not compliant, not extinct. By nightfall, the Howitzer's barrels steamed from use. The crew was down to their last 5 shells, but morale was higher than it had ever been. Not because they were winning, but because finally the enemy was bleeding. The Empire was done playing games. Orbital scans intensified, drones filled the skies, and a low, constant hum of atmospheric disturbance signaled the descent of something larger. They called it a corrective engagement. Humans called it overkill. The flagship of a regional fleet broke through the clouds, casting a shadow across half the valley. It didn't fire. It didn't speak. It simply hovered, as if its presence alone would smother resistance. But resistance had learned. The Howitzer crew had relocated again, dragging their cannon with a stolen alien tractor jury-rigged to run on ethanol. They had no illusions of survival. just purpose. A spotter with frostbitten fingers mapped new impact data using a compass and an old artillery calculator. They watched alien movements with binoculars duct-taped back together. Every detail mattered. Every second counted. Empire forces flooded into the mountains. New mechs, larger than anything seen before, with armor that shimmered against kinetic scans. Their weapons vaporized cover. Their scanners reached deep into the rock. But they moved like gods, slow, arrogant, exposed. That's what the humans needed. In the chaos of a last strike, a group of scouts had uncovered a massive fuel relay tower the Empire had hastily built to power ground operations. It wasn't heavily guarded. Why would it be? The Empire didn't believe Earth's primitives could recognize it, much less target it. They were wrong. Harlan's crew adjusted the Howitzer's aim, calculated arc and wind through guesswork and instinct, then fired a single shell across 14 kilometers. The relay tower vanished in a shockwave that turned night into orange daylight. A chain reaction of ruptured tanks and ignited energy fields turned the slope into a hellscape. Empire forces lost local power. Their shields flickered. Mechs shut down mid-step and collapsed into the snow like dying giants. Alien screams echoed through their comms. Panic followed. The flagship's orbit drifted, adjusting posture to compensate for what it hadn't expected, tactical resistance with prehistoric weapons. The crew of the Howitzer didn't celebrate. They reloaded. Alien command structures scrambled to regain control. Their broadcasts resumed, now layered with urgency and static. Cease all aggression. Compliance will be enforced. But even the voice sounded unsure. Every show of power was now a target. Every movement calculated by people who had spent lifetimes surviving without satellite support or automated logistics. The humans adapted faster. With every strike, with every loss, they became sharper. One by one, militia groups linked with other bands across continents using radios, flash code, even semaphore. A fragmented world started stitching itself together through fire. The Howitzer's next shell was meant for a mobile command vessel parked near a ruined monastery. Alien thermal cloaking failed to hide it from scouts who knew the land better than any map. The round struck the deck, punched through the armor, and detonated near its grav core. The vessel collapsed mid-lift. It felt like a meteor. The Empire began retreating from the ground, not because they were defeated, but because they were uncertain. Their algorithms, trained on thousands of conflicts, couldn't account for human irregularity. They adjusted projections, recalculated victory margins. Every new variable, the terrain, the analog weapons, the resistance coordination, dropped confidence thresholds lower. Then came the strike on the comms array. Using salvaged alien wiring, a technician barely out of high school rigged an interference signal that mimicked an internal Empire frequency. It didn't last long, but it was enough to bounce false orders into a patrol wing. Two Empire craft turned on each other. The confusion spiraled. Command structures fractured. In orbit, higher command debated escalation to a planetary sterilization protocol. It wasn't authorized. Not yet, but it was closer than ever. That decision paused for one reason. They didn't understand why a species this primitive kept resisting. With each setback, humanity responded not with despair, but escalation. They didn't surrender. They innovated, not upward but sideways. Not with new weapons, but with old ones used in new ways. And every time they fired that howitzer, it rewrote the Empire's understanding of what a war could look like. Inside that flagship, one commander reportedly asked, "What kind of people choose to fight with ruins?" The answer came hours later, when a final report logged the destruction of 3 more vessels by coordinated ground attacks using weapons retired centuries ago. The Empire learned something new that day. Humans didn't need parity. They needed opportunity. They didn't know when the last shell would be fired, only that it was coming soon. Ammunition was almost gone. The howitzer barrel was heat-warped and groaning with every shot. No replacements existed. No resupply was coming. But it no longer mattered. The weapon had already served a purpose greater than its payloads. It had become a symbol, a line drawn across Earth's soil that the Empire had failed to erase. What began as scattered defiance was now a global phenomenon. From mountain forests to city ruins, from deserts to frozen tundras, resistance was no longer about survival. It was about assertion that humanity existed not to be managed, studied, or subjugated, but to be reckoned with. And the Empire, for all its superiority, had been forced to recognize that. When orbital reinforcements arrived, they didn't descend with impunity. They moved cautiously, wary of hidden artillery, underground traps, electromagnetic pulses jury-rigged from microwave ovens and car batteries. Human creativity had rewritten the rules of the conflict. Technology mattered, but adaptability mattered more. Empire morale fractured in ways their species could barely quantify. Commanders argued. Data conflicts arose. Their soldiers, bred for precision and logic, couldn't process the chaos of human resistance. They couldn't adapt to a war where the enemy was unafraid to die if it meant taking one more with them. The final rounds were divided between strategic targets: a shield generator powering a no-fly zone, a field base transmitting planetary scans, and a dropship refueling pad. Each shot struck true, not because of advanced targeting, but because the crews had learned the land, studied the alien behavior, and made every calculation by hand under fire. By then, every resistance cell had its own version of Howitzer. Some real, some mocked together from scrap to confuse enemy sensors. The Empire couldn't tell which ones were active. Every hill could be a death trap. Every silhouette could hide a gun barrel. And with that uncertainty, control slipped further. Then came the signal. A single broadcast, captured and repeated through human radio networks all across Earth. Not a surrender. Not a peace offer. A pause. Empire forces will initiate withdrawal sequence. Hostilities suspended pending reevaluation. It wasn't mercy. It was damage control. The loss reports had reached thresholds that made occupation unsustainable. The cost in resources, in ships, in command integrity, it was no longer justifiable. The Empire hadn't been defeated, but had been wounded, and the wound bled reputation. Harlan's crew stood in the cold beside the spent Howitzer, its barrel stained with soot, its cradle lined with shell casings and snow. There were no cheers, no speeches, just silence. A hard-earned one. The retreat wasn't immediate. It wasn't total. The Empire still monitored, still hovered, still waited for the chance to reassert dominance. But they no longer assumed they would win by default. That assumption had been shattered by ancient steel and human stubbornness. News spread slow. Through coded messages, graffiti on walls, whispers in burned cities. Earth wasn't free, but it wasn't conquered either. It was suspended between two truths, one written by those who thought they owned the galaxy, and one written by those who proved they didn't. The Howitzer, once destined for a museum, was now revered like a monument, not because it destroyed ships, but because it changed minds. It forced an empire to reconsider what humans were capable of, not in terms of firepower, but in conviction. The resistance didn't disband. It went quiet, like embers under ash, waiting for the next gust of wind. Training manuals were rewritten. Old tactics were studied again. Military doctrine across surviving human enclaves shifted, not toward mimicking alien tech, but toward mastering irregular warfare. They had tasted what it meant to bleed a god. The Empire's data logs closed the campaign under a new classification: inconclusive hostility. Their records noted an unexpected escalation in ground-based resistance, unquantifiable adaptability, and psychological anomalies in enemy response patterns. They called it aberrant. Humans called it being human. The final entry in Harlan's field notebook was just a single sentence, scrawled in shaking hands before the ink froze in the pen. We were never supposed to win. They were just never supposed to lose. And in that, Earth had won something greater than victory. It had earned fear.